Well, as I said, when we get to Ecclesiastes chapter 10, we're rounding the final corner and heading to the conclusion of the book. By the time you get to Ecclesiastes chapter 10, Solomon has largely worked out all of the challenging issues that he raises in the book of Ecclesiastes. He has already worked through all of those enigmas that troubled him so deeply, and what even resulted in his momentary, temporary wandering from that right path. He's gone through all of that, and as he tells his story, and as the wisest man who ever lived, he explains how he got off track and how he found his way back. We find him expressing these fundamental truths that the most important issue in life is the fear of God. It is the ultimate response to the enigmas that we find and the problems, the corruption that we find particularly in our own lives. We are to fear God. But that fear of God doesn't mean that we look on our lives as meaningless. It doesn't mean that we look on this world as meaningless, as if there is no value in it. True, Solomon has taught us that if we just look to life under the sun as the be-all, end-all, we will find only disappointment. But instead, under the rubric of fearing God, he has challenged us numerous times to seize the day, to recognize the brevity of life, that our lives are but a vapor. But in that short life that we have been given, God is still a good God, and he has given us things in this world, this brief life, this material world, things to steward, things to enjoy. And with that, Solomon now is headed toward the end, and now the rest of Ecclesiastes reads more like what we typically think of when we think of Solomon. In fact, when we look at Ecclesiastes chapter 10, what we find is a chapter filled with aphorisms, filled with statements, with proverbs. We're going to see that as we look at the 20 verses that we find in Ecclesiastes chapter 10. And in particular this evening, as we look at Ecclesiastes chapter 10, we're going to find that Solomon is emphasizing to us that although wisdom has its limitations, it is still very crucial to our lives. He has told us already numerous times that if you look to wisdom, to the ability to figure things out with the revealed will of God, there still will be black holes. There still will be these unanswerable, undiscernible movements in God's providence that wisdom won't be able to answer. And that's why we need fear. Wisdom is crucial, but it has its limitations. Fear is what must dominate. But with that said, wisdom is still very, very important. It has its limits, but it is crucial to our lives. And what he does in chapter 10 is show us how wisdom is important on the path of life, in this brief life, as we live this existence under the sun. We will come across numerous unpleasant encounters. We will come across these moments, and there will be many, in which we will find frustration, in which we will find discouragement, unless we have wisdom. So I'm titling this sermon, Unpleasant Encounters. It's Solomon's summary of the kinds of things that we will encounter in life that have a tendency to discourage, but it's also Solomon's prescription of the kind of wisdom that we need to respond to these unpleasant encounters. There's going to be 5 of them, and the first one that Solomon describes for us is found in verses 1 through 4. And we'll look at these verses and find that the first unpleasant encounter that Solomon describes for us is that we will encounter foolishness along the road. Foolishness along the road, along life's path, in everyday experiences, we are going to encounter foolishness, and that foolishness is destructive. He begins in verse 1 by saying this: "Dead flies make a perfumer's oil stink." So a little foolishness is weightier than wisdom and honor. This proverb is similar to what we would say today, that one bad apple spoils the whole batch. He begins by using an analogy that would have been very familiar to the readers of his day, that of flies. Flies were the bane of existence in the ancient world. Today we can do some things to mitigate against flies. We have pesticides and all kinds of things to keep flies out, and we don't feel the effects of flies as much as they did in the ancient world. In that semi-arid land of Israel, the flies were particularly attracted to the homes because there would be food and there would be moisture, and the flies always had that way of getting into that which is even sealed. And the flies would even get into those jars, those containers that would have ointments, a very expensive perfume that would be kind of the special treasure of the household. Perfume was very, very expensive, but the flies would get in, even through the covers, the lids. And when the fly would get in, searching for that moisture, it would get entrapped by the oil and die, and its carcass, you could say, would then pollute the oil. And it would turn that which is particularly valuable, that which is to bring fragrance, it would turn it rancid. It would turn it worthless. And fools are like that. They're like flies. They're the bane of our lives as we encounter them. And here's why. They have a disproportionate influence compared to their size. A little tiny fly can get into a container of perfume, and that which brought a sweet aroma to the entire room, now that aroma carries with it a stench. It ruins the whole room. And folly is like that. It overpowers the sweet aromas, you could say, as Solomon does here, the sweet aromas of wisdom and honor. Solomon likens that to perfume. When there's wisdom and honor in a room, in a context, it's like fragrance, a pleasing fragrance. But there's something that is even thicker than that. And it's not something that's larger, it's actually something that's smaller, and it's the fool. And that little act, that little tiny action of folly can corrupt everything in the room. Now this statement in verse 1 connects it with what Solomon has just said in the end of verse 18. Look at it there, verse 18 of chapter 9. He said, "Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good." What Solomon is doing here now is, again, he's proposing and he is promoting wisdom as necessary, but he's saying, listen, if there's something that can counter wisdom in a disproportionate way, it's the sinner who destroys much good, 9 verse 18, and it is the folly who's foolish, it is the fool whose folly is more weighty than wisdom and honor. One commentator put it this way: it is easier to make a stink than to create sweetness. And there are endless instances of prices forfeited and good beginnings marred in a single reckless moment. And some of us know this firsthand. We can look at our lives and we can identify those times where that simple foolish remark, that simple foolish action, what we thought was no big deal, foolishly, actually has a significance, a consequence far, far greater than what we could have imagined. It just takes one foolish child. It just takes one foolish argument of a husband, one foolish look, one foolish choice, and life changes forever. And that's what Solomon's point is here, that we must remember, that we must be prepared, that we will encounter these moments when it's not even done by us, but it's done by others. There will be foolish actions that have these disproportionate consequences. Now he goes on in verse 2 in this section of the folly that we will meet along the road, this unpleasant experience. And he explains this in verse 2. He says, "A wise man's heart directs him toward the right, but the foolish man's heart directs him toward the left." Now, this isn't a statement about politics, although you could find a way to make it refer to that. But what he's referring to here is the fact that the governing factor in both the wise and the foolish ones are not circumstances. The foolish one or the wise one are motivated to do what they do, not by even their own feet, not by the context around them, not by the externals. Rather, this all comes from the heart. There is a reason why a fool does what he does, and there's a reason why a wise man will do what he does. It comes from the state of the heart. It's so very important to realize that, because when we look either at ourselves or at others, we can tend to exclude personal responsibility and think, well, this is just what the circumstances foisted upon the individual. That's why he made that decision. Solomon, by this verse, says, no. A fool does what he does because of his nature, and a wise man does what he does because of his nature. And in the ancient world, the right hand was the hand of blessing, and the left hand was the hand of dishonor. We see that even in Matthew chapter 25, verse 33, where Jesus says, "The Son of Man will gather the sheep and the goats, and the sheep will be put on the right hand and the goats on his left as they are prepared for judgment." In fact, the word sinister comes from the Latin word left. It's sinister. And in the ancient world, the left hand was always suspected of being deceitful, not trustworthy. You'd never shake with the left hand. You would never extend your left hand to somebody. And in many cultures, that's even the same today. The left hand is sinister. And that's what the fool, by his nature, not because of his circumstances, not because of the path in front of him, not because of his own feet, but because of his heart, he will perpetually choose that which is sinister. And Solomon asserts that disproportionate influence of that fool, his behavior, is not something that cannot be predicted. It's not something that's arbitrary. It springs from his own nature. Nature determines behavior, not circumstances. Solomon continues in this section, verse 3, he says, "Even when the fool walks along the road, his sense is lacking, and he demonstrates to everyone that he is a fool." That highly influential nature of folly cannot help but draw attention to itself. And that's the reality. Fools never conceal their identity for very long. And even, as Solomon says, in the very mundane activity of walking, of just walking on the path, even in the most mundane of activities, the sinner will make himself known. He cannot help but choose sin. The fool cannot help but express and display his folly. Inevitably, he'll open his mouth and his identity will be revealed. He'll do some kind of action and he'll reveal the state of his heart. That's the influence of the fool. These are the kind of people we will meet along life's path. As Solomon said in Proverbs 13, verse 26, "Every prudent man acts with knowledge, but a fool displays folly." One more verse in this section, as Solomon deals with the kind of folly that we will encounter along the way, he now describes a kind of folly that we will encounter that's not necessarily an everyday mundane activity, but a kind of folly that we will encounter as we interact with leaders. He says this in verse 4, "If the ruler's temper rises against you, do not abandon your position, because composure allays great offenses." The word ruler here refers to really anyone with a position of authority. And Solomon says that among such rulers, you will encounter foolish behavior. You'll have a boss who will treat you this way. You'll have a superior. You'll have somebody in the HOA. You'll have a police officer who may do this to you. You will encounter foolish behavior even among the leadership. And those authorities will show that folly by irrational behavior, by impulsiveness. They'll make demands and accusations that you think are unwarranted. They're not germane to the situation. They're exaggerated. Solomon says you're going to encounter this. This will be one of those unpleasant experiences, those encounters along the way, the folly. But Solomon is very clear here. You cannot fight fire with fire. He says, do not respond in that same kind of folly to what you perceive to be that temper expressed against you. Do not respond with impulsive words. Do not respond with angry resignation. Notice what he says. He says, do not abandon your position. And scholars have debated what that exactly means. Is that kind of a moral position? Do not abandon your moral position and lower yourself to the immoral standards of this abusive leader. Or it means that this is an actual literal position. It's a position of responsibility, and the superior comes and criticizes. His temper is inflamed, and he reacts and lashes out against you. And Solomon is specifically saying, look, if that happens, don't resign on the spot. That's folly. When your boss comes and gives you a hard time, and it is unfair, you didn't merit this, it's his temper. Don't react with some kind of fear. Don't fly away. Don't just throw your hands up and say, I quit. That's not what Solomon says is wise. Solomon is very clear here about how to respond to those superiors who exhibit this kind of foolish behavior. He says, composure allays great offenses. He's saying, listen, the best thing for you on many different levels, when you are confronted with the folly of a superior and their rash speech and behavior, is not to resign, it's not to fly, it's instead to maintain your composure and self-discipline. And this certainly corresponds to Solomon's teaching in other texts. If you go to Proverbs 15, verse 1, we all know this. We like to cite this, but it's so hard to practice it. In the first half of that proverb, Solomon says, a gentle answer turns away wrath. That's what Solomon says is the right response to a superior who is abusing his authority. He does not in any way prescribe or allow similar folly. That is not wisdom. Instead, he says the best thing for you, the best thing in the moment and the best thing in the long term is for you to maintain your composure and to respond with gentleness. And the book of Proverbs is filled with that kind of instruction. Proverbs 16:14 says it really clearly. The fury of a king is like messengers of death, but a wise man will appease it. That's where wisdom is. Proverbs 25:15, by forbearance a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue breaks the bone. And what Solomon is prescribing here is not just a momentary attempt to see whether it works, and if it doesn't, okay, then reach into the toolbox of wrath and see what kind of weapons you come up with. No, this is a way of life, a disposition that Solomon says does not come naturally, but is something that wisdom instructs you to cultivate, that ability, that when you are confronted by an abusive superior, you respond with composure, with gentle answers, with that kind of persuasion of a soft tongue. One writer says this: wisdom regularly touts the benefits of calm, rational responses to angry individuals, especially to those who have authority over us. Rash, defensive responses typically only increase the other person's anger and reduce the likelihood of rational solutions. So as we go along the way and we have the unpleasant encounter of folly on the way, this is what Solomon prescribes. Recognize the impact, the disproportionate influence, and when it comes face to face with you on the road, especially by a leader, maintain your composure. Number two, the second unpleasant encounter will be incompetence among the rulers. And when we go through this particular section, we will read into it all kinds of analogies of our own current governments. He says this in verses 5 through 7 of chapter 10. He says, "There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, like an error which goes forth from a ruler. Folly is said in many exalted places, which rich men, while rich men sit in humble places." Verse 7, "I have seen slaves riding on horses and princes walking like slaves on the land." Solomon again appeals to observation, and as we go through this, it becomes more and more evident that this is the one who writes, the one who comes up with this instruction is one who has had a very careful eye on governments, on how government functions. He has so many insights as to administration and government that it points over and over again to Solomonic authorship. And he looks to what he has seen under the sun. This is a reference to all of his observations, not only of his own administration, but of the administrations that he saw in the nations around him. And he said, "I have seen an evil." This is like a tragedy. And this is the evil, an error which goes forth from a ruler. Now, that word error doesn't indicate malicious intent. It appears to be a kind of error that is unintentional. It's actually a kind of error that arises out of incompetence, not necessarily out of an evil intent, but just out of plain incompetence. And this error is the ruler's inability, his ineptitude at finding qualified administrators, finding qualified governing officials. And that's the first place where you will find ineptitude in government. You might have some good-meaning, well-intentioned leaders, and yet you just got to scratch their head. They can't find talent if it was staring at them in the face. It's not that they are intentionally malicious. It's that they are unable to determine who will be the kind of leaders, the kind of governors and administrators who will serve for the benefit of the people. And this error, he goes on to say in verses 6 and 7, will be manifest in these two word pictures. They're parallels. The first one, he says, in verse 6, he says that folly, and that's referring to now culpable, malicious ignorance. Now you do have someone who is blameworthy. This ruler will unintentionally, non-maliciously, but ineptly find someone who is unqualified and blamably so, he will appoint such a person to an exalted place, a place of responsibility, a power. While the rich, he says, and this isn't being written in our day of class warfare, the rich he views as in a positive way. The rich are those who have been successful in life, who understand how things operate, and who have skill. That leader will instead leave the successful people in the humble places. They will be the ones who will be forced to go along with the decisions of the fools. He repeats that in verse 7 with a parallel description. He says, "And I have seen slaves." And what he means by slaves are those who are unequipped, unprepared, unqualified, the slaves riding on horses. Now, in the ancient world, the only people who ever had horses were the military commanders, the ultra-wealthy, those who are the elite. And Solomon says, "I have seen slaves riding on horses." In other words, being given the greatest level of prestige, while, notice verse 7, while the princes walk like slaves in the land. The princes, those who have been educated and prepared for leadership, they are the ones who are left having to walk in the dirt and having to bear on their backs the responsibility of supporting that administration. That is very, very common in our day. Solomon spoke of it long ago, preparing us for what we will see so often in government. When you read this today, it's like this is exactly what you see on all levels, federal, state, and local government. It's everywhere. Not only do you have the ineptitude of well-meaning leaders who cannot put together a good administration, but then you have the administration that they put together, which is malicious in its intent, utterly unqualified to do what they have been tasked to do, and they ruined everything. Solomon says, that is an evil under the sun. It shouldn't happen. Proverbs 19:10 says this, "Luxury is not fitting for a fool, much less for a slave to rule over princes." Another example is in Proverbs 30, verse 21 to 23. I won't read it all, but he's talking about things which make the earth quake. And he says, one of those things is when a slave becomes a king. Now, what's important to note as Solomon observes this evil is that he still does not call for revolution. And this is very important to recognize. Now, in this particular text, he doesn't give us any explicit response whatsoever. Unlike in the previous context where he talked about the proper response, in this particular context, he just warns us. He wants us to know this is reality. Men, be prepared to see this evil under the sun. But he does not call for revolution. Instead, when we look in the broader context, we do find Solomon's response to this. Back in chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, he talked about honoring your commitment, your oath, as a citizen of your country. In other words, that's terminology for submitting to authority. In chapter 10, verse 4, we just looked at it already. Solomon says, avoid impulsive reactions when you encounter that kind of ineptitude. In 10, verse 4 as well, he says, keep your composure. Do not allow yourself to fly off the handle or to become impulsive. And as he's going to say in verse 20, he's going to say, refuse to slander. That's Solomon's response to it. And this is very important because even in our day today, with what we see going on, we obviously see a great number of evils, all the way from the White House down to the local levels of ineptitude and malicious intent designed to try to destroy freedom and prosperity and put roadblocks up to the preaching of the gospel. We see it everywhere. And there's this important point that we're at where there are many men who need to hear Solomon's counsel. And Solomon is saying, this is not the first time this has happened. You're not the only ones. Now, that doesn't mean you just throw up your hands and say, well, that's just the way it is. But Solomon is indicating both by what he does not say, as well as what he does say in the context, be careful about how you respond to this evil under the sun. It is a very important topic that we must be thinking, especially as we head toward an election later on this year. And we'll talk more about that in the fall as we come closer to that and get into some new studies in the fall. But we must be ready to encounter that kind of an unpleasant experience on life's path, this evil under the sun. And you know what? In this world outside the garden, in this world that is under the curse, in which we see sin and its consequences everywhere we go, we must realize that we are going to encounter such kinds of ineptitude. Number 3, as we look at verses 8 to 11, Solomon warns us about another unpleasant experience, another unpleasant encounter, and it's going to be risk in the workplace. This is a very fascinating text as well. Verses 8 to 11, he begins in verses 8 and 9 saying this, "He who digs a pit may fall into it, and a serpent may bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones may be hurt by them, and he who splits logs may be endangered by them." Solomon here provides 4 illustrations of risk that one faces in everyday work. And each illustration here shows the real possibility of accidents, unexpected consequences of simply doing the kind of work that you're supposed to do. And as we've already seen in the book of Ecclesiastes, particularly in those carpe diem texts, Solomon says, embrace your labor. Embrace it. It's a good thing. It's a gift. Embrace both the labor as well as the fruit of labor. And yet as he compels us to look on work with that healthy view, he also tells us there will be these unpleasant experiences. There's risk involved. This risk is related to what we face in a life outside the garden. There's a realism that Solomon describes for us here. That once we're outside of Eden, in a world that is groaning under the curse of sin, there will be bent circumstances, there will be adversities, and some of those things will even come as a result of our sincere, faithful efforts to labor. Just think for a moment again of Genesis 3:17 to 19, as God curses the earth and as a result makes our labor risky. Genesis 3:17 to 19, "Cursed is the ground because of you, Adam. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you. And you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Now, whether it's digging a pit for a well, you might fall in. Tearing down a wall that needs to be replaced or moved, you might come across a hidden serpent. You might quarry stones and have one of them fall on you, or cut down logs and hit yourself with the axe. These are all very, very real possibilities, Solomon says. But he continues, he doesn't just leave it at that. He prescribes some proper responses and a reminder in verses 10 and 11. He says in verse 10, he says, "If the axe is dull and he does not sharpen its edge, then he must exert more strength. Wisdom has the advantage of giving success." Now, what does he mean, and how does that tie with what he has just said? Well, what Solomon is doing here is saying this: in light of the risks that attend our labors, in light of the possibility of accidents in the workplace, there's 2 appropriate wise responses to make. Again, Solomon doesn't just want to prepare us or to warn us of these unpleasant encounters. He wants to prepare us. And here are two responses that wisdom enables us to have in light of these risks. Number one, he says, work smarter. Verse 10a, when the axe is dull and it's not sharp, then obviously you have to exert yourself more, and through that exertion is going to come the potential for more danger. You'll wear yourself out, or you'll hurt yourself. You have to exert more strength, you have to expend more energy, and as you do that, you become tireder, wearier, and the potential for risk increases. So what does Solomon say? Work smarter, sharpen the axe, use wisdom to produce more with less. Use wisdom to do better more safely. And that particularly is the focus of the second piece of advice here when he says wisdom at the end of verse 10. Wisdom has the advantage of giving success. In light of these risks, Solomon says, prepare for work better. Use wisdom to mitigate the dangers. And for us as men, this is important because it means we have to do things like follow the instructions. And how hard is that? It's very hard. Who wants to do that? Follow the instructions. You're rewiring something. Don't just rely upon your intuition. Follow the instructions. Don't take shortcuts. Don't rush things. We had a neighbor on our farm who was servicing one of his pieces of equipment that would make hay bales. And as he went around it, he had turned the equipment on and it was running and got out of the tractor. And you're never supposed to do that. But he went around just to see how the round baler was working as it just stood there and ran. And he noticed behind one of the belts there was some garbage caught behind a pulley. And rather than going into the tractor to turn it off and then going back out, taking that extra 2 minutes, he decided he could put his hand by the pulley where the belt is and carefully reach through and pull out the garbage. And the belt caught his hand and in a split second took off the hand. Use wisdom to mitigate those risks. In fact, it's at that point where he gets to verse 11 and deals specifically with that issue. He says, if the serpent bites before being charmed, there is no profit for the charmer. Solomon concludes with a reminder saying this, that if you're called in to get rid of a snake and you commit an unforced error, there's no going back. Not only will you not profit, you'll be dead. And what Solomon is saying there is no one, not even the skilled, can undo damage after the fact, as one commentator says. You can't take a shortcut. You can't expect to be successful by bending the rules for the sake of time or cutting back on money or preparedness, and then think if you make a mistake, you can just hit the rewind button and do it differently. You can't. Once the serpent has bitten, there's no profit. It's over. Again, one commentator says this, we are being urged to use our minds and to look a little way ahead, for there are risks bound up with any vigorous action, and the person we call accident-prone has usually himself to blame rather than his luck. He should have known. He should have taken care. Number 4, another unpleasant encounter happens in the realm of conversations. I'm going to call this absurdity in the speeches. And it's found in verses 12 to 15. And Solomon begins by saying this, words from the mouth of the wise are gracious, while the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of his talking is folly, and the end of it is wicked madness. Now, Solomon has already said that a fool or a wise man will always act or behave according to their nature. Well, here we find the same truth once again. Jesus said it himself in Matthew 12:34, "For the mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart." And that's what we have here. Solomon says that the mouth of the wise men produces what he calls gracious words. That's how it's translated in our Bibles, but really it's out of the mouth of the wise comes grace. Comes grace. That which is life-giving, that which is encouraging, uplifting. That's what a wise man says. And that certainly follows through with what Solomon teaches in the book of Proverbs. And as you know, the book of Proverbs is filled with those kinds of reminders, like Proverbs 18, verse 21. "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit." Figure out how to use your tongue for life, and you will enjoy its results. Proverbs 11:30, "The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life." Proverbs 12:18, "There is one who speaks rashly like the thrust of a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." And we see that even in this text, the wise man brings words of grace, but the lips of the fool consume him. Now notice the kind of parallelism, the antithetic parallelism that's used here. First of all, the lips or the mouth of the wise produce words which are gracious. They build up others. But the lips of the fool not only fail to build others up, but the lips of the fool even destroy the fool himself. It turns on him. It's self-destructive. And the longer he talks, Solomon says, the more nonsensical he becomes. You just give the fool enough time, and he will begin to speak, and by the end of the speech, his ignorance will be put on full display. Solomon continues in verses 14 to 15. He says, "The fool multiplies words. No man knows what will happen, and who can tell him what will come after him? The toil of the fool so wearies him that he does not even know how to go to a city." Now, despite displaying madness, the fool just refuses to stop. He just keeps on talking. And one of the areas where a fool particularly manifests his folly is in making grandiose statements, particularly about things he doesn't know. And Solomon points to the idea of predicting the future, and that fools fall into this trap over and over again because of their self-confidence, that they will make these grandiose statements about what they know, particularly about what will happen. Solomon says, no man knows what will happen except the fool who foolishly believes he does. And Solomon says that this fool will speak from his mouth such idiotic, stupid things that he'll weary himself out, even to the point where he cannot even find his way home. One writer puts it this way: the fool is so incompetent, yet speaks with such authority that he's like the one who would get lost even when you put him on an escalator. He thinks he knows everything, and yet he can't even find his way home. That's the fool. And Solomon says, listen, you're going to encounter these on the path. Be ready. These are unpleasant. Number 5, another unpleasant encounter will be indolence among the stewards. And we find this in verses 16 to 20. It's a challenging text on a number of levels. The first part of it is straightforward, though. In verses 16 and 17, Solomon says this: "Woe to you, O land, whose king is a lad and whose princes feast in the morning. But blessed are you, O land, whose king is of nobility and whose princes eat at the appropriate time for strength and not for drunkenness." Solomon here first addresses stewardship at the level of nations. And he first pronounces a woe. He pronounces a woe on the nation that would have a lad for a king. And what he means by that is some inexperienced, immature king. And since immaturity and folly filters its way down, it seeps down, he has princes around him who are described as feasting in the morning. Now, wisdom tells you, you don't feast in the morning. Why? Feasting is to come as a result of labor, not at the beginning of it. But here are leaders, here are princes, inspired by their own immature king, who will waste in indulgence the resources of the kingdom. And the result of that is obviously a nation in decline. When its leaders are this way, when they feast in the morning, when their greatest concern is on their self-gratification and their work comes later, you have a nation in decline. But he pronounces blessing on a different kind of a nation who has a king of nobility. And that nobility speaks of a dignified maturity. And in the same way, that king sets the course for his administration, and his princes eat at the appropriate time. They don't indulge. They don't eat first, work later. They don't rest first and labor later. No, they first do what they're supposed to do, and then they eat, then they consume, then they partake of the resources at the end. And notice they do this at the appropriate time for strength and not for drunkenness. They do it for the sake of administrative success, to do a better job the next day, rather than to pleasure themselves in the moment. And this is a common theme that you find in the prophets in particular, of how the nations would be denounced, but particularly Israel would be denounced, and that God would send as punishment on the nation of Israel these kinds of leaders, these kinds of immature, self-gratifying leaders. You could look at Isaiah 3 and 5, and I'll let you look at those texts later. But after saying that, Solomon then moves to address stewardship at the level of the household. Notice verse 18. Through indolence, the rafters sag, and through slackness, the house leaks. And ancient houses in those days, as you know, were built with flat roofs. But there was always a gradient to those roofs so that water wouldn't pool on the top, because when water pools, it begins to penetrate, destroying the roof and leaking through. And the unfaithful steward, that sloth, he's the one who doesn't give attention to his roof. He fails to maintain its condition, and the rafters begin to sag when they should have been maintained and propped up properly, given that proper bow or that proper degree of gradient. He just lets it go, allowing water to pool and the roof to leak. By the way, we know of those proverbs, like Proverbs 19:13, that talks about the contentions of a wife being like a dripping roof. That's the same idea here. You have a dripping roof not only because of a contentious wife, but of a responsiblelessness in the man of the home himself. He's indolent. And what Solomon is saying here is that if attention is not paid to the everyday details of life, the results become a crippling liability. You're going to meet people like this along the way, that they have been given privileges and responsibilities. They may inherit wealth, they may have a time of success, and then they waste it all through indolence, laziness. Solomon speaks of this regularly in Proverbs. Proverbs 10 verse 4, poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. And it's an exhortation to us as well to steward what we have. Not to always be thinking of what we'd like better, but we actually do have things. Every one of us here has something, and the challenge is to take care of it. It means changing the oil in the car on time. It means paying your bill on time. It means painting the house before the wood rots. Of doing those steps of being a good steward so that you don't lose what you have. Then Solomon says this, men prepare a meal for enjoyment, and wine makes life merry, and money is the answer to everything. Verse 19. I read one commentary on this and it said, basically, we don't know what this means. On to the next verse. What does Solomon mean here, especially in that phrase, money is the answer to everything? Well, let's look at the language a little bit closely as we wrap up here. Solomon is tying due diligence to the ability to seize the day and enjoy the gifts that God gives. Now, notice the language of verse 19. It's very much like the Carpe Diem texts about enjoying meals and refreshment and the rewards of our labor. So many of those Carpe Diem texts, 2 verse 24 to 26, 3 verse 12 to 13 and verse 22, 5 verses 18 to 19. We looked at one in the previous chapter 9 verses 7 to 10, that intensive one. In fact, listen to what Ecclesiastes 5:18 to 19 says, and you can see the similarity in the language. Solomon says, "Here is what I have seen to be good and fitting, to eat, to drink, and to enjoy oneself in all of one's labor in which he toils under the sun during the few years of life which God has given him. For this is his reward. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God." Solomon is again commending enjoyment. He's commending refreshment. He is commending money as something that will help you in this life, that in the everyday aspects of life, he's saying you'll need it. He's not advocating a kind of communistic lifestyle here. In fact, much to the contrary, this statement really is intended not to be cynical. It's not intended to be materialistic, but he's trying to be realistic and beneficial. And he's saying income and ownership and wealth as the result of preparedness, as the result of wise preparations, as a result of hard work and good stewardship, that's a good thing. You can enjoy those things. But it's not going to come if you're indolent, if you're lazy and you don't steward what you have. Finally, he makes this statement at the end. He says in verse 20 of chapter 10, "Furthermore, in your bedchamber, do not curse a king, and in your sleeping rooms, do not curse a rich man, for a bird of the heavens will carry the sound, and the winged creature will make the matter known." This is where we get Twitter from. Solomon concludes with this twofold warning about slanderous speech. He says it twice. Do not curse a king, and do not curse a rich man. And he's going to explain here that these things are, first of all, principally sinful, but more importantly to his purpose here, they're pragmatically detrimental to you. He says, or we could look, for example, at the law. Moses said in Exodus 22:28, "You shall not curse God, nor curse a ruler of your people." And that is a consistently held truth that we find throughout all of Scripture, Old and New Testaments. You are not to curse your leaders. But practically speaking, there is a benefit to speaking positively, because when you speak slanderously, word gets around. The walls have ears, and you will be hurt by it. And what's interesting to note is that like the tiny little fly in verse 1, and like that camouflaged little serpent that's hiding behind the wall, and like this little sparrow, a little tiny thing like slander can cause for you big problems. Don't do it. As we wrap up, let's draw some final applications. Let me give you 4 applications here as we close and move to discussion. First of all, as you read Ecclesiastes 10, it's immediate. We are to expect these unpleasant encounters. Do not set your expectation that in this life you will have this smooth path, this easy life. In fact, the whole crisis among young men today of what we call mental illness is this inability to deal with the adversities of life, the inability to deal with these unpleasant circumstances. Solomon is telling us This is going to come. You're going to experience this. You're going to encounter these things. It's life. Deal with it. Secondly, prepare for these unpleasant encounters. He has given us instruction here about wisdom and how wisdom, in many of these cases, provides very direct, concrete responses to these kinds of unpleasant encounters. And so we must study Ecclesiastes 10, we must study all of Scripture to see the practical instruction that's given to us so that as we realize these encounters will come, we will be prepared for them. Number 3, learn from them. Learn from them. Learn from these unpleasant encounters. Learn about your own life, where the weakness is. Your tendency to fly off the handle when you encounter someone else who has done that to you. Learn from it. Mortify that folly in your own life that arises when you encounter folly yourself. Learn from these unpleasant encounters. And number 4, determine not to cause them. Determine not to cause them. By the grace of God, as you fear God and as you seek to learn His ways, and you seek to learn through His revelation of what wisdom means, what it means to reflect His glory and to live for His pleasure, that you determine that you are not going to be that fly in the ointment. You're not going to be that fool along the path or that authority that speaks derogatorily toward others and so on and so forth. And you will commit yourself to be the man of wisdom that Solomon upholds. Let's pray that the Lord makes that true in our lives. Father, as we close our time of direct study in Ecclesiastes 10, we thank you for the clarity of your word. We thank you for its concrete instruction and how this word written 3,000 years ago still provides such crisp instruction to the challenges and unpleasant circumstances we face in our own lives today. May you press these things deep within our own hearts. Lead us on this path of wisdom, and ultimately we are thankful for Jesus Christ, who is our wisdom and whose death on our behalf has ushered us out of the land of darkness and into your glorious light, that we might learn and live to your glory. It's in His name we pray. Amen.